Materials and Applications has produced more than 20 temporary site-specific installations and over 100 programs presenting new ideas in art, architecture, and design. And as if all this weren't enough, Gu is also an architectural historian. She's a doctoral student at UCLA's Critical Studies in Architecture program. Her research is focused on the use of scientific and form-finding models in post-war architectural practices. I would add that research of one form or another runs through all of Gu's work, and this could be maybe a good question for the end. What is sort of research in architecture? So somebody needs to write that down and ask her. Turning now to biographical details, Gu holds a BA in Visual Arts from the University of California, San Diego, and a Master of Architecture degree from UCLA. She has worked for firms in Germany, Spain, and Korea. She has taught history and theory courses at SCI-Arc, USC, and Cal Poly Metro, and she has served as the Associate Director of the Summer Institute in Architecture at UCLA. Gu's projects have been recognized and supported by UCLA, the Graham Foundation, Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, Los Angeles County Arts Commission, and the Pasadena Arts Alliance. Gu brings together in her work a unique set of domains: architecture, art, research, teaching, institution building, and private practice. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Matt. My name's Gia. The danger of putting your bio on a website, someone will read it and then embarrass you with it. But I really first should thank Vivian Lee for the invitation to present our work at Materials and Applications. That's sort of the foremost of this talk. And of course, I have to thank Matthew for the introduction. I met Vivian 2 years ago at a Becoming Digital conference. I was really enamored by the student work from the workshop that she conducted. And I've never met Matthew, but I know him from his prolific publications on the computerization of architectural work, alongside the ensemble of instruments and tools. So I'll be speaking a little today about what we do at M&A, which is primarily to put architectural work on display. And I'll be taking a few cues from my title, including the term work and small and institution. And can you guys hear me okay back there? Great. Not working. Speaking of work, it doesn't work. Let me try. I'll just click it. So in architecture, which I'm told you're all studying, when we hear the word work, we are more accustomed to pairing the term with the idea of creative labor. And implicit in the question often posed to architects, so for example, implicit in that question that you maybe get asked later in your life when you're a careerist, what kind of work do you do? Which is like a nightmare question because it's like commercial or residential. Or a designer to a designer will ask, what work are you working on? Or a student to a student that you guys have probably asked one another, did you get any work done? So the idea of architecture as a kind of work, and not to say a job, is derivative of another, more important idea attached to creative labor, which is the idea that all the work, or at least all the good work you do, eventually leads to the masterwork, the magnum opus, or the masterpiece of your creative labor. So all this to say, in architecture, when we say the word work, we implicitly mean genius labor. But that is not the work I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about the work of grand architects. I'm going to be talking about the work of what it means to run a small architecture institution, which is not the work of a genius, but the work of bureaucracy, which I think encompasses its own opportunities for creativity. So when you see M&A in pictures, this is the kind of work you'll first notice. Large-scale architectural installations the size of apartment buildings. As Matthews mentioned, since 2003, we've produced over 25 site-specific installations embedded in the residential landscape of Los Angeles. We take underutilized spaces in the city, like this empty courtyard space, and transform them into a temporary pocket park through the commissioning of new public art and architecture projects. And then we invite the public to participate in our projects either through the constructive act, so through building workshops, or in the form of a kind of experiential model of viewing. So this was a project by Warren Teckington, 2014, that was exploring the craft of pipe bending in architecture. All of our projects are both spectacular, but also somewhat experimental in either material form, tectonics, fabrication, and as you'll see later, a kind of more self-reflective gaze on architecture as itself a practice. This is typically how the project as people experience it. It's a key aspect of our work to allow people to feel engage with the work in a public way without kind of a mediation of, let's say, a guard, like a security guard in a museum, without admission, without any kind of institutional framing that you might experience as you walk into a museum or a gallery space. It's meant to be a kind of work that's situated in the environment the way architecture is situated, kind of unmediated, which is arguable, but let's just go with that for a sec. Ball-Nogue's Maximilian Schell is another project, a spectacle the size of an apartment building constructed of tinted mylar. This was one of the first projects we produced. And this was actually eventually, so this is the view from the courtyard, and kind of spectacle encounter in the space. It eventually led to their commissioning of the PS1 Young Architects Pavilion. So many of our artists and architect teams eventually go on to do larger projects after having experimented a little bit with their ideas within the scope of our institution. This is Doris Sung's Bloom project, an installation made out of smart thermobimetal, a sheet metal that curls when it's heated, transforming the architectural object into a sun tracking device that indexes time and temperature in a shape alluding to a woman's Victorian era garment. And Jimenez Lai, who I think has taught here, he's an alumni, great. So the sort of like predecessor to who you all will be, maybe. A rotating module, so this is the Fallon Stairway module. It's a rotating module that was born from the idea that all surfaces, including ceilings and walls, could serve as functional space. This is an illustration that diagrams the rotation of the space and then the body's awkward accommodations to it. So not yet entering the question of comfort, but at least functionality. And finally, one of the more recent projects we commissioned was by the Los Angeles Design Group. This is their pink hillside landscape called The Kid Gets Out of the Picture. It's a contemporary update on the aesthetics of the picturesque, featuring the work by figures like Laurel Broughton, Andrew Kovacs, First Office, and Jason Payne. And then alongside more spectacular installations, we also produce a number of public programs and engagements. Some of our past projects include this temporary mini golf project by 9 architects, a dance party in the birdcage, a publication launch party, a conversation about whether a building can own itself, so something discursive and speculative, an investigation into alternative forms of housing ownership. I don't know if you know, but the word mortgage means a death pledge, which I think is very revealing of the financialization of housing, and a public steam bath session with Michael Park's Steam Egg, which is a public sculpture and fully functional steam room that's mirrored on the outside and mortared on the inside. So the egg you see that the woman's climbing out of can fit 6 people, and it's meant to be a very immersive experience where we invite an herb J, which is like a DJ but for olfaction, to sort of play with the scent of the steam as you're in it. So many of our projects are really publicly oriented. So because we're known to produce these types of architectural spectacles, we are often referred to as an architecture gallery, but we're actually not a gallery, nor are we an exhibition venue or a funding agency. So that leads us to the question of what are we? I've been using the word institution, which is a very loaded word, because when you think of institution, you might think of a kind of space of great authority like a museum, or let's say a space of knowledge production like this university. And when I was asked to speak about materials and applications, and what I had sort of casually thrown out, I was like, I'll talk about the institutionalization of architecture. I was using the word pretty liberally and without really any scholarly authority. When I told Vivian I wanted to talk about architecture's institutionalization, I was primarily thinking about the processes by which architecture, whether you define it as a field of knowledge, as an object, as an idea, as a discourse, as a practice, whatever you want to call architecture, when architecture encounters the institutional apparatus, what happens to it? So the institutional apparatus isn't just the name of the institution, but also the space, and neither is it just the space of the institution, like the white box of a gallery, but it's also its audiences, its value systems, its mission statements, its coordinating bodies, its organizational charts. Meaning I was thinking a lot about how certain aspects of architecture become instituted, how they become established as a convention or a norm within an organization or a culture. And that's sort of the driving question to how we operate on materials and applications. We think a lot about what it means to be a kind of architectural institution in a very specific landscape of Los Angeles. So despite the very technical suggestion of our name, materials and applications, it sounds so heavy. I bet you thought I was going to teach you something about materials and applications today. I'm not. So it's neither a museum nor is it a research institute. In fact, we started in an architectural non-place, which is this front yard parking lot of an artist's home. So Materials and Applications was founded by an artist who, Jenna Didier, who came out of a kind of arts culture of the machine art scene in San Francisco. So there was an emphasis more on the kind of making aspect of installations than, let's say, the showing or the kind of totally critical inquiry. Was really interested in how do you build. And of course, architects instantly gravitated towards this kind of space. So over 15 years, by the way, I came in maybe 4 years ago to M&A as a director when Jenna stepped down. So over the 15 years that M&A has been running, we took this non-place and set a number of processes in place, establishing norms of the way we work, but also the way architects would work. And that is the fundamental question to what we at M&A on the back end of our organization ask ourselves. How does what we do initiate and shape the response by architects and by audiences? I came in as director in 2015, and I decided to rethink the way M&A was working as an organization, primarily asking the question, what an organization of architecture, what should an architecture organization be in Los Angeles, and how does it serve? So LA is a very different city than Toronto or any city that you might be coming from, let's say. It's weird. It has 5 to, depending on what you count as schools, it has anything from 5 to 8 schools for architecture. We have an abundance of art museums, I mean hundreds of art museums and galleries, but I would claim there's no institution dedicated exclusively to architecture. This might be the case in Toronto, because I know there's a CC in Montreal. Is there a space here? So what that means is you might have an art museum that sometimes puts on an architecture show. You might have the Getty Research Institute, which has an architectural arm, but only really puts on exhibitions of the work in their collection. But you don't really have an institution that's thinking about architecture in a contemporary condition and thinking about how to exclusively engage it and how to devote its resources in the curation of architecture. So we do have, for example, a Museum of Architecture and Design, which is sort of a collegial museum on to us. But they've never really housed their own curatorial staff, and a lot of the programming often comes from the outside. So I think these things are really important to thinking about what it means to be an architecture space. Who's programming, who's defining, who's conceptualizing the work that you do and then the work that you show. So one of the other questions that we're asking ourselves a lot these days is, can we or should we still be making spectacular experiential installations in the era of pavilions and Instagram? So our models in the past have often, we've often been compared to like the PS1 or Serpentine, which is like 100 times our budget. And also, by the way, Serpentine's a commercial gallery, and PS1 is a contemporary art museum attached to another major institution. So we're not quite like these spaces, and should we be operating like them is a really important question. We're also not, we were talking about this earlier, we're not really like Storefront, except maybe we're getting closer to it, in that Storefront has typically operated within a gallery convention of exhibitions on walls and looking at things within a framed module, in a kind of framed way. So we reworked our mission statement when I came in as director. And we did this with a kind of conversation with people that you'll never meet because they're not here, but they're really important to our organization. We have a board of directors. There are fiscal and legal guides. We have an advisory board. They're sort of our think tank. And then we have a contemporary council, which is actually constituted of people closer to you guys, who are recent graduates, who are young professionals, who are interested in architectural programming. We reworked the mission to be more expansive and specific. So the mission as a nonprofit is extremely important. It guides our work. It's both our thesis and our moral philosophy. And it's also what funders look at to figure out what you do. So our mission, Matt read this, Materials and Applications is a nonprofit cultural organization dedicated to exploring the role of architecture in the public sphere through critical exhibitions and programs. We commission new work that gives space to exceptional experiments across multiple disciplines while challenging the relationship between art, architecture, and public encounters. And we do this through an annual calendar of programs, including installations, performances, workshops, and conversations. We explore how art and architecture can transform underutilized spaces into unexpected encounters. So all this to say, that is the, let's say, official statement of what we do, and then this is our value system. We are a nonprofit organization, and I'll speak more on each point separately. We're an architectural project space that produces new work. That's really important. We don't show work that's previously existed. We always put up or commission work in a new capacity. And then I would say we are the only independent institution in Los Angeles foregrounding architecture and emerging ideas through material-built physical work. So for us, it's really important, whether you call it an installation or whether you call it a sculpture, that the work in some capacity is dedicated to producing a kind of built project, which is increasingly rare if you think about what is possible for young architects these days. So each of our values are linked to an action. So this would be, we organize to be small, critical, responsive, public, and propositional. So the institution is also in a way propositional. And I think this idea of a nonprofit is also a kind of, it's, let's say, a really important aspect to how we operate. So this is because part of this talk is also like, what if you want to start a nonprofit architecture space? You can do it. So one thing to keep in mind, it is not true nonprofits don't make money. A lot of them make a lot of money. We don't make a lot of money. But it's a definition. It's an economic definition that's really important to keep in mind. It's a definition of a third sector form of labor, which is voluntary work. It has often been applied to charity work, which is where people get the idea that it's free labor. But nonprofits are not free. They're actually remarkably robust as an industry. They're maybe like, I think they're higher than the travel industry or larger than the travel industry. All this to say that if your model of the world is there's government work and there's commercial work, there's this amazing sector called nonprofit work that I'm secretly a huge nerd about, and I'd be happy to also talk about that with you if that's of interest to you. And it doesn't even have to be about architecture. There's other ways to work in nonprofits. But it's what I think, like, let's say, by definition, it's really interesting because it's also a kind of alternate economy. So it's an economy of giving, called the third sector, next to governance and commerce. It kind of was. So if you think another way to think about it, it was also a way of redefining charity work so that it could be calculated in the GDP of the country. So it's a way of formalizing voluntary labor to become financially accountable, to have numbers, to give work, free work, a number that can then be translated into a broader economic definition. But part of what it means to be a nonprofit is that we have a public obligation. So we have a lot of liberty and autonomy as an arts organization, but we also have an obligation to think about what we're offering as a service to the public. And I wasn't sure if I should do this, but if you are interested in this, you can find every nonprofit's public work through their tax form in the form of a 990. You go to guidestar.org. I feel like Matt might be really into this. Literally every organization that's a nonprofit that has to file taxes in the U.S., you can look up their budgets and you can look up what and who is paid. And this is really interesting because it really gives you an understanding of the hierarchy of labor, but also the distribution of wealth, let's say, whether it's going to programming, staff, administration, operations, like where's the money going? Follow the money. It's like the only thing I talk about running a nonprofit. Okay, so that was kind of like the bureaucracy of the nonprofit world. These are this is the second set of the kind of like value system and the actions we do. So it's an architectural project space that produces new work, programs, and networks. Oh, sorry, I mishighlighted. We commission new projects. And I think that's super important. We really don't ever show work that is merely a representation of another body of work, meaning a drawing or a model. We always try to show the thing unto itself. There can be a whole critical discourse about why we do that. I don't really want to get into it. Let's say it's part of the history of our work that we're committing to, and that we're, it's not a mission that I established from the beginning of the organization, but it's something that I steward as a director of an organization. So the built project is part of our component. And I'm going to share a little bit of what are the new works we're going to do in the next year. So we have a really fun, but sorry, before I get into that. So commissioning new work, committing to their funding and communicating their values. I think when you think of curation in this day and age of Instagram, you think of Instagram. But you also think that curation, if you're not familiar with the word, curation becomes a selection. You pick 5 people, put them together, show them on a wall, and that is an act of curation. But if you're a curator, with some intentionality, you also think of curation as an act of constructing relationships between objects or between, let's say, projects or ideas. So let's say if you think of labor, if you want to conceptualize labor, one idea of curatorial labor is you pick a time, date, title, and a description of a project, and you put an image up, and that is essentially curation. And there's actually been, if you look very closely, there's a number of architectural projects or exhibitions that really curate as if it's Instagram. So I think a recent one I'm thinking of is they asked 100 architects to submit an image, text, and a model. I mean, that's literally Instagram. They formatted the exhibition and invited architects to submit something, and that was the act of curation. I think we try to be more intentional about this. This is literally what we do when we curate. So this is actually a diagram, so I say literally, it's not literally. This is a diagram produced by the Women's Center for Creative Work, which is a kind of sister organization to our work that we look to often as a model organization. And these are the steps they have mapped out to show people what it takes to actually program one event. And you start with something, like finalizing a theme is already like way too advanced in the process of the programming, but you can see it's like essentially for them a 25-step process that requires a number of actors and a number of engagements. It's not linear. It's like it's a very convoluted pathway, but that requires communication. It requires some organizational effort. And this is just a kind of close-up. So at this point, what they're showing you isn't even the conceptualization of the program. It's literally just the act of funding and communications. But what I really like is at the end, they always have to start again. So this is a feminist organization. This is the source of the model. I thought it was a really great diagram to show you what the work is if you were going to put it down in a kind of diagrammatic way that we do in the organization, which is highly collaborative and highly involved and takes much longer than people anticipate to put up a show. If we put up if we put up 2 projects in a year, that's actually a huge production for us. So if you're interested, and I'll show you a little bit more at the end, some of these other examples of organizations that work in a kind of small arts nonprofit manner, there's a lot of resources for you, and I'll get to it. But this is the Women's Center for Creative Work, and this is their organizational handbook that talks about what it means to run a feminist organization. Okay, so the third, M&A is the only independent institution in LA dedicated to foregrounding emergent ideas through built, material, and temporary architecture. And that means that part of what we saw previously is that we conceptualize, coordinate, and curate projects into being. So we think of, it's not direct authorship in the sense of this is the work of the genius architect, but there's another kind of work that happens, which is the institutional labor. Part of what drives our work, let's say part of what drives our questions about the organization is that we want to resist the gallerification of architecture, which is essentially the idea of putting architecture into spaces, into, let's say, a white wall neutral space, the kind of construction of a neutral observer in that space, and the presentation of architecture that's borrowed from the institution of art, which is a very different kind of discursive condition of viewing, I'd say. So some examples would be of these types of projects that you would see that I without let's say, putting them down anyway. This is just a model of work that we're not really interested in, but that other people should feel perfectly interested in pursuing. Putting models on pedestals, a kind of sign for me of the preciousness of the model. It's interesting if you think about the model as a kind of dirty object. It was meant to be a process object. A model was always serving the architect within a kind of process condition. Here's an exhibition of models that are put on display as an art object closer to sculpture. We are sort of built into the way you guys are working, generally as architects, and probably part of the discursive conversation is that you are all, I think, maybe this is the thing in Toronto, I don't know, every school is different, but you're all learning to make representations, right? Yeah. Is that translations? Is that a thing here? Okay. Robin Evans, you read him. Yes? So this idea that architects only work in representations also kind of naturalizes Okay, but I really do want to, have you read Robin Evans' translations from Drawing to Building? Raise your hand. Okay, so then I really need to give a little bit of background. Don't mislead me, Vivian. Okay, so this is I don't know if you've even heard this, but just shake your head if you're like, I've never heard this. There's a common thread in architectural discourse that architects don't make buildings, we make representations. Have you heard that? Yeah. And it's kind of true in that if you think about what you do as students, you are representing your projects through an ensemble of mediums, whether it's the drawing, the model, the digital software, the digital model, the tools that you have at hand that you're cultivating as a skill are tools of representation, much more so than the tools of construction and building. And maybe you guys are all too young to even be in practice, except this is a practice thing, so I guess. Anyway, just all to say, that's a common line of thread. And what that does is it naturalizes the ways we think about displaying architecture, which is we often think of displaying architecture through its representational modes. So we're really interested in pushing back against that idea, not because there's necessarily anything universally incorrect, but that we think there's other ways and other values to producing an exhibition that's not just the representation of the work. So another tendency that's happening in exhibition making right now in architecture is this kind of fuzzy group making. So this is the new sculpturalism show at MoCA Los Angeles about 3 or 4 years ago. And the premise of the exhibition was to present a generation of architects based in Los Angeles that were interested in a kind of form making or a formal condition of architecture. So in this way, curation becomes an assemblage of names and an assemblage of a group rather than setting up an ontology of relationships between different kinds of work. And it's really interesting. Laurel Broughton had brought this up in a colloquium like a few years ago. She talks about this, rather than like the anxiety of influence, she discusses it around the anxiety of belonging. So there's a kind of generational anxiety about like, what group do I belong to? Probably because the history you've received as architecture students is a history of eras and styles and groups and movements and clusters of people influencing one another. That's sort of the historiographic convention that has been presented in traditional courses on history. And I think there's a generation that's also trying to resist the group-making process of exhibitions. And I think that's sort of what we're pushing against also. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, but social media has radically changed the landscape of how we operate as a nonprofit organization dedicated to public architecture. So originally, the idea of putting art or architectural installations in public spaces was kind of a way to get out of the museum, right? To get out of the museum into the public's eye. Publics that don't necessarily visit museums or institutional spaces that they might not have access to. But social media has redefined what the public sphere is. So now you can easily be public if you have an Instagram account. And so the kind of political potency of making installations as public projects has really lost its edge in the kind of economy of the experiential art model. I don't know if you guys have this in Toronto, but there was like a museum of ice cream in Los Angeles, which was a museum that was literally just installations about ice cream. That was the Instagram fad of like 2016. And that's what we're basically competing with and, let's say, trying to define ourselves against the kind of consumer social media model of an installation where it's like photo, and then hashtag whatever, you know. So it's a challenge, and we don't have any answer. But these are the things we're thinking about. So we're actually no longer in the courtyard space. We moved out of that courtyard space about 2 years ago. It was a transition. We have a new project space, which is also a temporary project space in a storefront on Sunset Boulevard. We don't yet have a specific title, but we're thinking about calling it tenant improvement, because that's what it is, really. We're given a space, and then we're asked to make improvements upon it. I'm going to show you just the two projects that we have coming up. So this is Lossy Lossless. It's the first project we'll have in the new storefront space. It's by Extense, which is composed of Cyrus Penarroyo and McLean Clutter. It's a Michigan-based team. Vivian knows them. So Lossy Lossless casually assembles a handful of Sunset Boulevard's past and future objects together. These are screenshots of the neighborhood, and they've isolated the individual elements that they're interested in tableauing. And then they produce a custom-made tableau that wraps the walls of the space with markers of the boulevard's history, as well as signifiers of its nascent gentrification. So piles of tires from a bygone era of flat fixes commingle with newly installed bike racks, payphones, and boutique placards. Some elements are ghostly and translucent, while others are willfully pixelated and, let's say, caught up in a loss, a moment of disappearance or loss. And then within the space, they've installed tiers of raised floors and custom foam padding that fills the storefront, ready to accommodate almost any activity. So the hard tectonics of data tiles, which is the flooring they're working with, merges with the collages of imagery which project a future entry into this new Sunset space. So for us, this is a little soft launch of the space. We're testing it out to see what it means to have an installation in a storefront, how we can still keep to some of the philosophies of our projects, but let's say also work in this new constraint. So the conditions of the display change. What was previously occupiable, open to the public, you can enter at will, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. anyway. Now this operates more as a window display. There's sort of two modes of viewing. There's a front end where you're looking at it through the storefront, and there's a back end where you can walk in. So this is, a plan view of the space. This is the entry on Sunset Boulevard. This is the window system. And then you enter here, and you can come in, but we can't keep the space open because we have no capacity to actually operate an organization that is like a gallery. So what we decided to do was treat it in two modes, one as a space of activity and another as a space of display. In the days when we have no activity, you can still view it. In the days when we have an activity, it's a kind of model where one architect, one activity. The architecture is infrastructure for the activity that takes place. Sorry, I lost my, let me just, here. So this is kind of shifting a little bit from our mission, and this is the first of a series of projects that really thinks about what does it mean to pair an architect with an activity in a space that's interiorized, a kind of inside installation rather than an outside, or what we're right now calling a build-out. In our upcoming project, it'll be really fun. Lyda Aguirre is doing the next one, I think, in summer. And she's going to be designing the infrastructure for a women's wrestling team. So there'll be kind of wrestling bouts happening in that space. Okay, I think I'm missing a slide. So is this, okay, I see, my notes are in the wrong place. Well, okay. So the next project, which is a fall 2019 project, is Michelle Chang's Scoring Building. It was the finalist for the open call staging construction. Oh, I realized, okay. So the call for projects explores construction as a kind of practice and a performance. So it's thinking about construction not at the final end of its activity, which is the installation, but in the front end. So to think a little bit about what it means to guide construction as an architect, whether it's through drawing or instruction or a kind of process-based approach. So Scoring Building is both a spatial installation and an architectural performance that centers on construction's durational aspects rather than its finished form. The means with which design is translated to building has often been thought to be the act of drawing, but what if we consider it to be manual labor? So these are some of the labors that she's considering as a, let's say, instructional act that she is embedding into her project, meaning she's not forefronting the final piece of the design, but she's thinking about how she can intervene and mediate all the steps before the thing is finalized. This is an example. So this project would require instructions for building to center on temporal qualities: quickness, slowness, duration of manual labor, also the politics of labor, over the finished formal qualities of the object itself. The whole project borrows from the repetitive processes of William Basinski's composition, the disintegration loops, to reveal the creative potentials of building, suggesting that the intensity of labor on the front end of building, which is what we typically call design, can be met with an intensification of labor on its back end. So this is an illustration with annotations of the labors performed to construct the drywall system, and then she's trying to produce a notational system that identifies the actual duration of time for each moment of its construction. So she's playing a little bit with the, let's say, the production of, let's say, instruction, architectural instruction, trying to rethink how we define architecture's process, and then also thinking about, we're thinking a little bit about who the laborer might be in this project. Okay, so I'm actually just coming to an end. So starting your own small architecture institution. This was an example of what we've done. I've only been doing it for 4 years. Someone did it before me for about 10 to 11 years, and it actually started, if you remember, in a parking lot with no institutional structure, and we built those institutional structures. And I'm also happy to talk to you about that component. But if you want to start your own architecture institution in Toronto, there are some really nice resources for you that you might want to look at to think about what it means not only to show work, but to design the conditions of showing work. So the Women's Center for Creative Work, we talked about their feminist organization. It's not only applicable to people who are feminists, although I hope most of you are. It is also just a really great handbook for how to organize, because what you'll find is organizing is the fundamental activity of running an institution. And then we have this amazing art space called Machine Projects in Los Angeles that sunsetted, meaning it deliberately closed its doors. But they had also written a nice guidebook for how to start your own art space, how to produce workshops, and how to curate, and plan events. And they're really thoughtful guidebooks that sort of have you think about what it means. A lot of them are forefronting art, but I think the translation to architecture isn't so difficult. And then a final really great resource for you is the Common Field Network, which is a United States network of 400 plus artist-run small arts organizations. So they're an amazing resource for arts organizers if you're interested at all. And hopefully, I think like maybe 2 people in this space will be interested. But if I've touched 2 people today in their lives of starting an art space, that would be great. And I think, and this is just sort of what they have on their website as examples of the kind of resources that they offer. Okay, and I think that's the end of my talk. And you can find out more about us, obviously, in all of the different channels online. Okay, we're going to take some public questions.
Yes.
Is that what the chair's for?
No,
No?
that's for,
That's
there's
for
a
later.
part 2.
All right.
Hi. So I was just wondering, because we, as we all know, Silver Lake is quite of a crucial instance of gentrification in Los Angeles, and we often hear about artists and artistic institutions being pointed as precursors for this process of gentrification. So I was wondering, what do you make of that assumption, and how has Materials and Applications addressed that context in which it works?
Yeah, it's a huge question in Los Angeles. I think it's happening in Toronto, which is you have a housing crisis, and you have a conversation about who's responsible for a housing crisis. And I think that artists and art spaces are a very easy, visible go-to point for, let's say, the nascent conditions of unaffordable housing. So it's kind of a 2-pronged question, because one question that's really important is, what should an arts organization do when they're confronted with their own enablement of that change in a neighborhood? And then the other question is, where do we place the responsibility of affordable housing? So I've taken a kind of position which is that M&A as an architecture organization, we also engage in programming that thinks about, that's self-reflective of our role as an organization, that also engages with non-architects and a broader public to think about alternative modes of housing and financialization. I think fundamentally for me, housing is a question of financialization, not culture. Then let's say for an organization like M&A that has been in Silver Lake, and we're now going into Echo Park, and if you've ever read like Forbes or Wall Street, I don't know, these are like the two epicenters of like trendy, chic boutiques in Los Angeles. And let me say, just to be fair, in some ways we are the recipients of a kind of privilege as an art space because we can't afford to pay for space. So in some ways we're like people who can't afford space, but we are often given spaces because there's a kind of visible value for what financial, cultural, debatable to an art space. So what we try to do is be really careful about the kind of collaborators we work with. So we are very stringent that we never work in a kind of commercial capacity. So I don't know if it's clear to you, but the work we do doesn't fall under the auspices of a kind of commercial architecture. We haven't resolved the problem of being in these like epicenters of spaces yet. But all I can say is we make sure that the people we collaborate with, we try to build vocabulary with about what it means to be. So we are the experts, let's say, in housing and gentrification processes because all of our networks are basically architects. So that's our level of expertise. So what we're interested in doing is building networks with organizations like a writing literacy workshop in the neighborhood, kind of a local organization called Los Angeles Poverty Department that works with the homeless and, let's say, staging their lived experience of homelessness. We also work with the Women's Center, which is a kind of activist advocacy network. So we make sure that our partnerships are always aligned with the values of careful, thoughtful programming. And that's really, we have to sometimes face the limits of our agency as an organization. We're not going to revolutionize housing in LA.
Any other questions from the public?
Thank you for the talk. I really love the bit about genius and bureaucracy, and I think you really brilliantly connected bureaucracy, which is sort of undervalued usually. One way of giving it value is connecting it with feminist organization work. I think that's like fabulous. I'm wondering though, there seems to be how do I put this? The bureaucratic work seems to be happening within this institution you've created, which is great. But you still have the architects always acting as geniuses. It seems like it's still sort of genius work being put on display. And from what I know about your own kind of architectural work, you also kind of work in that mode, which is it's a good mode to work in, right? But okay, when Henry Russell Hitchcock, decades and decades ago, wrote this famous article on genius architecture versus bureaucratic architecture, he was thinking very much as bureaucracy as a creating a type of architecture, a kind of anonymous architecture. He was thinking about the post-war reconstruction effort and the kind of planning of cities that needs to be done, and trying to kind of impart a value to a particular type of architectural design. I'm curious, I guess about two things. In your own work as an architect, are you sort of working as a bureaucratic architect? And when it comes to curating or displaying architects' work, do you kind of seek out that sometimes, the kind of that particular type of undervalued labor, let's say?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Essentially, the work we're producing still follows an art model in the sense that we have authors, we have titles, we have a kind of display of creative labor in the form of installation. So that's in either case Spina-Goo, but also M&A. So I'll answer right now for M&A. Let's say that's the question for us. So the critical question for us right now is not how can we, because there are people working on this, how can we redefine the architecture of architecture, right? How can we rethink how architects practice? I think the focus on bureaucracy isn't to find architects, although some programming has looked at that, isn't to find architects that are rethinking the kind of system and conditions by which they can design or trying to redesign those systems and condition. We're staying pretty narrow in that we first want to redefine and redesign what the institution is. And hopefully in this kind of process of redefinition, which is something we're still undergoing, we can think about a way in which it's not forefronting the Genius model, but with one contingency, which is we also need funding. And the curious aspect of our organization, and actually what you'll find as an architecture organization, there is almost no funding for architecture, period, point, blah, unless it's a patron model or a corporate model of building practice. So when you argue, like what we have to argue all the time for funding, that we're an architecture organization, please give us money, it doesn't translate. So some of the conditions set on an organization is that we do have to translate some work within the institutional parameters of art funding. And art funding also, of course, in all kinds of ways, privileges the genius. That, in weird ways, much more heavily than, so maybe the model is like social art practice has tried to shift away from the genius, but it's inevitable. The minute art or architecture touches an institution, the institution produces and authorizes a kind of authorship that's elevated, right? So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's like not a thing we've resolved. As for Spina-Goo, I completely hear you on the kinds of, let's say then in that way we're working within the constraints of an academic practice, because while we have construction and buildings and all that, my partner and I both teach a lot, and we work within these kinds of forms, and then I would say that's the constraint. But I don't know if we fully defined our practice. Hopefully not. Good question.
I also have questions for you, but I will reserve those for the latter portion of our day. Thank you very much, Gia, for joining us. And thank you for those of you joining us from outside of class. Just a reminder that next week is our reading week here at Daniels, so there'll be no lecture series the coming week. And then for those of you in my class, please scoot up and we'll take what time is it? We will take a 10-minute break and rejoin at 1.